Hello, Mystery Squad, and welcome to another episode of Darker Things. I'm your host, Doug Duncan, helping you navigate the twists and turns of your journey in the dark as we take deep dives into history's most disturbing events, personalities, true crime, conspiracy theories, and urban legends. Now, when we last left off, we took a look at Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her transition from child abuse victim to murderer to social media darling. Today we take another look at the Gypsy Blanchard case, but this time with our focus being placed on the catalyst of it all, Dee Dee Blanchard, the queen of deception and her battle with mental illness. Here to present you Dee Dee's tragic descent is Langdon Matthews. Thank you, Langdon.
Have you ever thought about how mental illness can manipulate not just one life, but many? In the chessboard of life, we often forget the unseen players, the puppeteers behind the scenes. One such puppeteer was Dee Dee Blanchard, a woman whose life story reads like a chilling thriller. Born in Louisiana in the early 60s, Dee Dee was a seemingly normal girl growing up, yet as she matured it became evident that something was amiss. Dee Dee, in her adult years, was diagnosed with Munchausen syndrome by Proxy, a mental health problem in which a caregiver makes up or causes an illness or injury in a person under their care, such as a child, an elderly adult, or a person who has a disability. This diagnosis, however, was a late discovery, and by then, the damage was already done. The victim of Dee Dee's manipulation was her own daughter, Gypsy. Gypsy was made to believe that she was chronically ill, suffering from a myriad of diseases. Dee Dee's manipulation was so profound that Gypsy spent most of her life in a wheelchair, despite being completely able-bodied. Gypsy's health and life were used as mere pawns in Dee Dee's twisted game, a game fueled by her mental illness. This game, however, wasn't without its repercussions. The puppeteer's strings began to unravel, leading to a tragic climax that no one saw coming. But we'll get there. Right now, let's focus on the players of this game. The king in this case is the mental illness that controlled and manipulated every move. The queen, imprisoned by her own mind, is Dee Dee. And the pawn, trapped in a life she did not choose, is her daughter Gypsy. So let's delve into this intricate game of manipulation, where the king is mental illness, the queen is Dee Dee, and the pawn is her daughter Gypsy. Dee Dee Blanchard didn't start as a queen of deception. Born in Louisiana, in a family with a history of mental illness, she was an ordinary girl with an unremarkable childhood. It wasn't until her teenage years that the first signs of her manipulative behavior began to surface. She was known to write bad checks, engage in petty theft, and even commit credit card fraud. These early transgressions were merely the tip of the iceberg. Dee Dee was not born a queen, she was made one. Her crown was not made of gold but of lies and deceit. The pawns in her life were not chess pieces but people, manipulated and used for her own twisted game. Her upbringing was marred by the presence of an abusive and alcoholic father. This environment may have contributed to the formation of her manipulative behavior, as she learned early on that deception was a tool for survival. Yet it's important to remember that these experiences do not excuse her actions but rather provide a backdrop to understand the complexity of her character. As she grew older, her manipulative tendencies escalated. She began to fake illnesses, not for herself, but for her daughter, Gypsy. She would tell doctors that Gypsy was suffering from a range of serious conditions, from leukemia to muscular dystrophy. This was Munchausen syndrome by Proxy, a mental illness where a caregiver makes up or causes an illness or injury in a person under their care. These early signs of Dee Dee's manipulative behavior were not recognized for what they were. Instead, they were seen as a mother's desperate attempts to care for her sick child. And so, the stage was set for a game of deception that would span over 2 decades, ensnaring countless unsuspecting victims in its web. Dee Dee's game of manipulation was only just beginning. Every pawn in a game of chess has potential, and Gypsy was no exception. Born into a life of deception and manipulation, Gypsy began her journey as a pawn in Dee Dee's intricate game. A pawn, seemingly insignificant but bearing the potential to change the course of the game. As a child, she was subjected to numerous medical procedures, unnecessary surgeries, and bound to a wheelchair. All while her mother, the queen, painted a picture of a sickly child to the world, reaping sympathy and benefits from their unfortunate circumstances. Gypsy was a pawn, moved by the invisible hand of her mother. She was told she had illnesses she didn't have, forced to play the part of a helpless child, her voice silenced by the deceitful queen. The pawn was moved, square by square, maneuvered into positions that served the queen's interests. But a pawn isn't without power. It holds the potential to change, to break free from its path, and Gypsy was beginning to realize this. As Gypsy grew older, the seeds of doubt began to blossom in her mind. She started questioning the narrative her mother had so carefully crafted. The internet became her window to the world outside the confines of her manipulated reality. She observed the discrepancies between her life and the lives of others, and the cracks in her mother's facade started to show. She discovered truths about herself that her mother had kept hidden, truths that contradicted the narrative she was forced to live. This realization was the first step towards her emancipation. The pawn, once moved at will, was now contemplating its next move, its own move. The pawn was beginning to question the game, the rules set by the queen, the manipulations and the lies. The pawn was no longer just a pawn, it was on the verge of becoming something more, something powerful. Gypsy, the pawn, was beginning to question the game. The king, in our story, the mental illness, held the power over the board. The king, in the game of chess, is both the most valuable piece and the most vulnerable. Similarly, Dee Dee Blanchard's mental illness was the force that drove her actions, yet it was also her greatest weakness. Dee Dee suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental disorder where a caregiver makes up or causes an illness or injury in a person under their care. In this case, the person under her care was her own daughter Gypsy. This illness, this king, dictated Dee Dee's every move like a puppeteer controlling a marionette. It was an insidious force that twisted and turned her life into a dark labyrinth of lies and deceit. Like a king in a chess game, Dee Dee's illness was always present, always influencing her actions. It was the reason she convinced everyone, including Gypsy herself, that Gypsy was severely ill. She manipulated medical records, deceived doctors, and spun a web of lies so intricate it was almost impossible to see the truth. But this king's power wasn't confined to Dee Dee alone. It extended its reach to Gypsy as well. Gypsy, the unwitting pawn in this complex game, was led to believe that she was genuinely sick. This belief was so deeply ingrained in her that she accepted the unnecessary medical treatments, the countless medications, and the wheelchair she didn't need. The king's power also affected those around them. Friends, family, and even medical professionals were drawn into this twisted game, blind to the reality of Dee Dee's deception. They saw only what the king wanted them to see: a devoted mother taking care of her sick child. But remember, in every game of chess, the king is the most vulnerable piece. His power is absolute, but his safety depends on the other pieces. In our story, the king's power began to wane as Gypsy started to question her mother's narrative. The king's power was absolute, but every game has a turning point. In the game of chess, a single move can change everything. In the life of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, that move was meeting Nicholas Godejohn. This encounter was the first step towards the unraveling of the intricate web of deception spun by Dee Dee Blanchard, her mother, the queen of this real-life chess game. Nicholas, an outsider to the Blanchard family's twisted dynamic, became a pawn in his own right, but his unawareness of his role didn't diminish its significance. He was drawn to Gypsy and her seemingly innocent desire for freedom, completely unaware of the depths of Dee Dee's manipulation. This was a game he didn't even know he was playing. Gypsy found solace and an ally in Nicholas. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to break free from the chains her mother had so meticulously crafted. Their relationship, however unconventional and hidden, was a beacon of light in her otherwise dark existence. It was the turning point she had been waiting for, the move she needed to make to escape her mother's clutches. But as we know, every move in chess comes with consequences. The queen, Dee Dee, started to sense a shift in the game board. Her carefully constructed world was threatening to crumble. Her pawn was starting to rebel, to question, to seek an existence beyond the boundaries she had imposed. The game was no longer under her control. Gypsy, on the other hand, was embracing this change. She was learning that she was not just a pawn in someone else's game, but a player in her own right. She was ready to challenge the status quo, to question the rules that had been set for her. She was ready to fight for her freedom no matter the cost. The pawn had made a move and the game was about to change drastically. Every game of chess ends with a checkmate. In the twisted narrative of Dee Dee Blanchard's life, the final move was as shocking as it was inevitable. A pawn, once manipulated, had turned into the most potent piece on the chessboard. Gypsy, the seemingly innocent pawn, orchestrated the murder of her own mother, the queen, Dee Dee Blanchard. Dee Dee's life was a web of lies, deceit, and manipulation, all driven by her mental illness, the king of this chess game. It was a life where the queen was imprisoned by her own mind, trapped in a cycle of manipulation and deceit. Her pawn, Gypsy, was the innocent victim, subjected to unnecessary medical treatments and forced to live a life that was a lie. But every pawn has the potential to become a queen, and Gypsy, in her desperation for freedom, made her move. She convinced her online boyfriend, Nicholas to murder her mother. Godejohn, another pawn in this game, was easily manipulated, and he committed the act that would bring the game to its tragic end. The aftermath of Dee Dee's murder was a media frenzy. Her life of lies was exposed, and the world was shocked at the extent of her deception. Gypsy, once seen as a helpless victim of her mother's manipulation, was now viewed as a master manipulator herself. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison for her role in her mother's murder, while Godejohn was sentenced to life. The game was a tragic one where the players were driven by desperation, manipulation, and mental illness. It was a game that ended with a checkmate, but it was a game where no one truly won. The game was over, the king was toppled, and the queen was no more. In the aftermath of a game of chess, the board is cleared, but the impact remains. The echoes of Dee Dee Blanchard's life, like a haunting melody, lingered long after her death. The game she'd been orchestrating for years, using her own daughter as a pawn, had come to a brutal conclusion. In the wake of the murder, the public grappled with a narrative that was far from the simple story of a sick child and her doting mother they'd been led to believe. The unveiling of the Blanchards' twisted reality sent shockwaves through communities nationwide. Dee Dee, once seen as a devoted mother, was now understood as a master manipulator, trapped in her own game. Her mental illness, the silent king in this game, had not only dictated her moves but also ultimately led to her downfall. And what of Gypsy, the pawn-turned-player? The trial that followed was a spectacle of its own. The courtroom became another chessboard, and Gypsy, once again, was at the center. The young woman who had been portrayed as a perpetually ill child stood accused of a heinous crime. The public's reaction to the case was a mix of shock, disbelief, and in some instances, sympathy. Many struggled to reconcile the image of the frail child with the woman now standing trial. Yet others found that understanding the depths of Dee Dee's manipulation made them empathetic towards Gypsy. In the end, Gypsy was given a 10-year sentence, a checkmate of sorts. It seemed the game was finally over. However, the aftermath of this chilling tale continues to raise questions about mental health, the healthcare system, and society's role in recognizing and addressing abuse. The story of Dee Dee Blanchard and her daughter Gypsy is a stark reminder of the power of manipulation and the devastating consequences it can have. It's a testament to the need for better understanding and care for those suffering from mental illness, especially those who are underinsured or uninsured. The game was over, but its impact continues to resonate. So, what can we learn from this real-life game of chess, this intricate dance of manipulation? From the outset, we've journeyed through an enigma wrapped in a paradox, namely the life of Dee Dee Blanchard. We've seen how her mental health, the unyielding king, dictated her actions, leading her to become an imprisoned queen in her own twisted narrative. Her life was a series of manipulations, each lie, each deceit, a calculated move in a dangerous game of chess. The tragic finale, a desperate act by a desperate pawn Gypsy and her accomplice Nicholas, underscores the severe consequences of unchecked mental illness. But beyond the macabre, this tale underscores a salient point: the urgent need for better mental health care. The Blanchard saga is a stark reminder that we must prioritize mental health, especially for those who are underinsured or uninsured. Remember, every individual in the game of life deserves support, understanding, and care.
Sadly, many times in tragedies such as this one, we look for someone to blame. We look for a villain to cast in the story. And all too often, the villain takes the form of a person. And in the case of this, the world has largely pinned all the blame on Dee Dee Blanchard. But if truth be told, Dee Dee is just as much a victim as was Gypsy Rose Blanchard or Nicholas Godejohn. Caught up in the thralls of mental illness, the villain, Munchausen by Proxy, set into motion devastating circumstances that no one saw coming. Thank you for watching Darker Things. If you were intrigued by today's episode and you haven't already done so, I invite you to hit that subscribe button below and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss any more of our journeys into the dark. Give us a thumbs up and let us know in the comments section below what you think about the video or about the topic at hand. Let your voice be heard. We want to hear from you. As always, I'm your host, Doug Duncan, with a reminder that once you enter the dark, you may never be the same.